Welcome to the London Jesuit Centre. My name is John Moffatt, and this is our podcast series for teachers to help you think around some of the big philosophical and theological ideas that come up in November, the month of the dead, and December, the month of Advent and Christmas. In the last episode, we explored ideas from the wider intellectual environment in the Greek-speaking world of the New Testament. We saw how those ideas allowed first Jews, then Christians and Muslims to develop an understanding of life after death that blended their own scriptural traditions with standard accounts of the natural world. On some of those ancient accounts, the soul is a separable, non-material substance acting on physical bodies. On others, consciousness is an integral part of the material world. However, in all cases, ourselves are not accidents, but primary realities in the world. This gives a basis for theological anthropology, a way of thinking about the human self in relation to God and the world. It points the way to giving some content to the enigmatic phrase in Genesis that humans are made in the image and likeness of God. It is the human soul stuff that mirrors what God is like. Humans are like God because they are capable of consciousness and loving relationship, of a creative engagement with the world, of being good, just, compassionate. It is worth noticing how different this is from other ancient ways of thinking about the God-human similarities. True, the gods of the Greeks and Babylonians could dispense justice, hear prayers, and grant favours. But they were also greedy, jealous, quarrelsome, and violent. Just compare the violence of the creation myths of Egyptians, Babylonians, and Greeks with Genesis 1. But the picture of the divine that emerges in the Hebrew writings of the 6th century, and which Plato argues for 2 centuries later, is a something or someone for whom creativity, goodness, and justice is intrinsic. For Jewish and Christian writers, this had a consequence for how they thought about the meaning of life. This is reflected in the stories they told about their heroes. If humans were made to be like God, they were made to represent the same goodness, justice, and compassion as their Creator. The flip side is that when humans fail to be good, compassionate, just, and so on, they are falling short of being fully human. They are failing to be like their Maker. And to fail to resemble the Maker, the source of life, was to distance oneself from that life. It was a corruption or destruction of the self. The unjust soul of Plato and the sinful self of the Jewish tradition are damaged persons. Plato borrows a powerful image from the legendary punishment of the daughters of Danaus, who had to atone eternally for murdering their husbands by filling a basin full of holes. Plato uses this image to describe the soul that neglects goodness and justice in the addictive pursuit of its own pleasures. Just as the Danaid's basin can never be filled, so too the addictive soul can never be satisfied and at peace. In different ways, the Jewish, Greek, Christian, and Islamic traditions have continuously intertwined with each other, each in their different ways promising a pathway to the good life, the life of the healthy soul, capable of drawing close to the true source of life and happiness. All the traditions emphasize the importance of wisdom, whether it is proverbial wisdom inherited from antiquity, or the wisdom embedded in the instructions of the Torah, the Gospel, or the Quran, or the wisdom that arises from rational reflection on the natural order for Plato and the Stoics. And of course, the figure of the sage and the holy man or woman is just as important in East Asian, South Asian, and African cultures. But we also need to recognize ways in which this narrative of the human self, as made by God in God's likeness, has been challenged, particularly in the last 3 centuries. Mainstream ancient science created a place for soul, for goodness, for meaning, and for purpose in the universe. Modern science, or at least some modern scientists, seem at best to ignore that place, and at worst call it into question. This is a major feature of the culture we are a part of, and we need to help our students reflect on this well and honestly if we are really to help them formulate a credible understanding of themselves and their own life stories. Let's start with the challenge of the theory of evolution. The basic problem here is that it seems to promise an explanation of who and what we are in the world that doesn't need a creator, let alone suggesting that a relationship with God might matter. In the first phase of evolutionary theory, there was some wiggle room for compromise. Evolutionists were puzzled by the way the different evolutionary pathways taken by species all seemed somehow purposive. We saw last time how the idea of consciousness as an intrinsic part of the material world was popular in the late 19th and early 20th century. Some suggested there was a life force driving evolution, even though there was nothing like the classical creator God or lawgiver God of Judaism and Christianity. This belonged to the family of ideas usefully labelled panpsychism, everything is soul. The Jesuit philosopher-scientist Teilhard de Chardin won thoughtful respect from some non-Christian scientists in the first half of the 20th century when he integrated these ideas into theology and reworked the narrative of what it meant for humans and the universe to be saved and made new. He identified Christ as the one through whom all things are made as the goal of evolution, and the Spirit of God as a guiding force running through the universe. But then came the second phase of evolutionary theory, which is still current. When DNA was discovered as a complex chemical which carried something like a program code for generating different kinds of living organism, and which mutated naturally, the idea of a purposive life force guiding evolution seemed to become unnecessary. For many people, molecular biology seems to provide an adequate, purely mechanical explanation for all those rather mysterious things to do with the evolution of modern humans. It is also now widely and plausibly believed that a lot of potential for human behaviour can be encoded in the naturally evolving DNA passed on from parent to offspring. From there, it appears a simple leap, though it is actually a very complicated leap, to suppose that ultimately all behaviour, including intelligent behaviour, can be explained in this bottom-up way. The most popular narratives of the human self in this style graft the model of DNA-based evolution directly onto Daniel Dennett's idea that my inner sense of me is really just a byproduct of the evolutionary apps that help physical me's survive. Put all that together, and the reason why human social codes and behaviour emerge is because it helps the DNA that codes for them to replicate better. There are no virtuous souls in reality. There is only evolutionary successful DNA. You'll find this sort of evolutionary anthropology presented by Richard Dawkins in his book The God Delusion. It gives a very different picture of the human self from the one that dominated the philosophical traditions of the ancient world and which feeds into classical Christian anthropology. But its broad outlines do have a lot in common with the ancient school of philosophy founded by Epicurus, who explained everything in terms of atoms and the void. You may remember, in Epicurus' world, the soul consists of atoms that just dissolve on death. But evolutionary theories are not the only challenges to traditional philosophies of the soul. New empirical approaches to psychology have also undermined classical theories of the self. Traditionally, philosophers sat back and theorized about us as we see ourselves, starting with our powers of reason. But Sigmund Freud famously started to analyze the content of the soul as a scientist. He tried to scratch beneath the surface of the stories we tell about ourselves about what we are doing and why we are doing it. Beneath those stories, he claimed to discover the basic mechanical forces at work beneath the surface, the things which really drive behaviour. This approach turns traditional psychology on its head. Our conscious, reasonable self is no longer primary. It is merely a surface story that hides deeper and often darker realities about the basic instincts of the human animal. The rich variety of what we think is going on in our heads, especially in the area of ethics, religion, and decision-making, is reduced to something much more primitive. Ultimately, a repressed history of violence and sexual jealousy ingrained in the memory of all humans. Freud's older contemporary Karl Marx had also suggested that the surface stories we tell about our world and our lives in it are an unconscious cover-up. But his real story is very different. It is a political one. He interprets our personal narratives, social, religious, ethical, aesthetic, as the deceptive products of the surrounding culture. For him, each cultural context determines the stories we tell about ourselves and how we should live. But those stories then reflect and protect the existing social and economic power structures. Behaviorist psychologists went even further and didn't bother with narratives at all. Behaviorism focused not on our inner states, but our actions as programmable responses to the world around us. The criterion for evaluating our real inner states is not what we sincerely report, but what we actually do. Those apparent inner states, however rich and important they may appear to us, are strictly speaking scientifically irrelevant to explaining our behavior. We can see how well these sorts of approach, which deconstruct the self and its stories, fits with the artificial intelligence model of human selves promoted by Daniel Dennett and others. Our sense of ourselves becomes an accidental byproduct of our hidden software and makes no difference to what would happen anyway. There are many important and useful insights about humanity and human culture in these modern alternative accounts of the self. Pope Benedict acknowledged that as he engaged with Freud and Marx in some of his encyclicals. But it is also important to notice that this is an area where all the theories are so broad brush and the detail on which they rely is so complex that it is hard to see how to prove a definite answer. So there are many people, scientists, philosophers, and psychologists, who welcome the established conclusions of evolutionary theory and depth psychology, but are cautious about extrapolating from those conclusions to a whole theory of humanity that empties being human of meaning and value. Some, in fact, find the popular hardware-software model of the self fails to do justice to the raw data of what it feels like to be a me. Me is one of the first things I know about the only world I know. How can I possibly write it out of the story I tell about that world? As a result, that older idea that even the most basic matter is a primitive sort of self has become popular again with some philosophers. On that note, let's take a break before we come back to thinking about which modern ways of thinking about the self or soul can best help us make sense of those many ancient narratives, religious and philosophical, that suppose we survive after death. So thank you again for listening, and see you next episode.